are now moving for the next presentation. I am trying to read because no, it is not necessary. Thank you very much. Okay, so the subject is the media narratives, mainstream discourses in conventional media, newspapers, and TV, by the PI of the project, Verónica, Sarah, and Filipa. Okay, so. Okay, you can start. Yes, for sure.
Thank you. I think I'll stand. So thank you so much. This, yes, of course.
Then I can back.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. So this session is about the methodology we used for the first package of the ABIDE project. So I'd like to start, for those in the audience, namely the online audience, but maybe some of you also here in the room, that still, sorry, it's not working, the command, again. Sarah, can you, please? It was working just now, okay. Just to say a few words about the project and introduce you to the project. The ABIDE project stands for Animal Abidings, Recovering from Disasters in Modern Human Communities, and is a project funded by the European Research Council through a consolidated grant. And what we're trying to do in this project is to study animals' experiences of disasters, in particular wildfires, in 3 different countries: Australia, Brazil, and Portugal. The project goes through 4 different phases. There's a slight feedback, or is it my impression? So in the first phase, which is the phase we'll be focusing during this symposium, so this is important to tell, we won't be discussing in this symposium results from all the phases of the project, also because the project is only by the end of the 2nd year, so we're now starting the 3rd year. And what we've been doing is we've been focusing in the first and transitioning to the 2nd phase. So the first phase of the project was about exploring mainstream narratives that are conveyed mainly through official documents and policy documents, and also through the media. And we had specific goals in that project, in that phase. One of the objectives, and I'll be talking about the objectives soon. So now, just to present you the other phases. The 2nd phase is about observing the animals themselves and how the animals are behaving and are reoccupying territories that have been damaged by fire. And in the 2nd phase, we are supposed to use multispecies ethnography and also to map the geographical movements of the animals and how animals are recuperating. And then in the 3rd phase, we want to restore this topic. So what we want to do is we want to incorporate the animals' lessons that we hopefully are able to collect in the 2nd phase, in this phase of observation. And we want to tell new stories about wildfires and about animals recovering from wildfires and multi-species communities recovering from wildfires. And finally, in the 4th phase of the project, we want to engage with the multiple stakeholders, and this means the local populations, of course, but also firefighters, for instance, policy, local governance stakeholders, politicians, those that are actually governing disasters and taking the decisions when the disaster outbreaks. So, this is to say that today and tomorrow we will be focusing mostly on the 1st phase. In particular, today we'll be focusing on the 1st phase, and tomorrow we'll try a sneak peek into the 2nd phase, which we already began. So we already began doing our multi-species ethnography. Today we will try to understand what are, from our perspective, of course, our preliminary results on these mainstream narratives told by the policy documents and by the media. And tomorrow we'll try to brainstorm together about how we can challenge those mainstream narratives. So just to make sure that we are in the same page, we are in a learning process, so let's make this a learning event. We are all here to brainstorm together, and the ABIDE team, will most welcome all your comments and contributions to our discussion. So the first phase, as I was saying, is about understanding the narratives of disaster and wildfires in particular, namely in the media and public policy. And so in the next slide we can see that we tried to do this in three, so our objective is to go through these topics in the three countries that are the target countries of the project: Australia, Brazil and Portugal. Of course, these countries are very different in scale, Australia and Brazil being huge countries as opposed to Portugal. And of course, we are focusing in each one of these countries in particular areas. In Brazil, we are focusing in the biome of Cerrado. In Australia, we are focusing in the area of New South Wales, which burned a lot in 2019-20. And in Portugal, we are focusing in the center zone in Serra da Estrela. In this first phase, so narratives of disaster, our goal was to interrogate how animals are represented in these documents, whether they are visible or invisible, and when they are rendered visible, what kind of visibility they get. And we try to do this as I said, in the media, in particular conventional media. This means newspapers and television, as I'll explain, and public policies. One of our ambitions was to develop what we called a transnational framework, so a kind of a framework to analyze this kind of documents and to put these questions, a framework that we could use across the three countries, across the very different social, political and historical realities. And I think this is the moment today and tomorrow to discuss, and namely in particular tomorrow in the roundtables, it will be the moment to discuss whether this is actually possible and whether this is even desirable. Do we really need a transnational framework, or are things so context specific that we really should let go of having this ambition of having a common framework, a common method, and just embrace the specificities of each area. And we had a very specific goal also, which was to narrow down the choice of the local multi-species communities that we should observe in stage 2. So this choice for New South Wales and for the Cerrado biome and from the Serra da Estrela, so the specific areas in which of the three countries, the choice came from both our need to follow the fire, which is, from our point of view, very interesting in a more than human project. So fire being a strong more than human presence in our project, we had to follow it, and we had to follow the zones that had burned not that long ago when we started the project. That was one of the criteria. The other criteria was actually the species that were most mentioned in both these documents, the policy documents and the media documents. So the methodology we used, we are talking about collecting data and analyzing data, and this data being legislation and institutional documents on the one side and media news. So both, I think one characteristic of this methodology that we find interesting is that this methodology, we use the same methodology to the media analysis and to the policy analysis. And this allows for a methodological consistency that it's not that we can actually compare, but we can bridge and we can put in dialogue many of our results, and this will enable us to discuss the interplays, the interconnections between the media agenda and the political agenda in an interesting way from our point of view. So data collection on the one hand, and then data analysis, which was a mixed methodology, so it's mostly quantitative, so we quantified the occurrences, but of course we quantified something that we previously analyzed from a qualitative point of view, so we analyzed each piece of document and made qualitative categories that then were quantified. This provided two main databases, and that's something that we would also like to show today and to to describe as an output which we find valuable from the project two databases, one from the media that covers the 3 countries. Of course, there's a variable per country that we can then separate each country if we want to do analysis just on one country, with several years. So in Portugal, we began in 2017, and then we added 2022, 23, and 24. And in Brazil, we chose, so the criteria to choose these years were years that we find particular relevant, kind of turning points in the way we find that animals began to show up in these discourses. Of course, we don't have comparative data because we did not collect data that was published before that. But this is a starting point. And the policy database, we adapted the same criteria we had already developed for the media, and that is what allows the methodological consistency that I was talking about. So this means that the project will, or is already delivering as an output 2 databases that will be made public and once the project ends. Right now they're still under analysis, but as soon as we finish the analysis and the project ends, these 2 databases will be available, and this means that other researchers can use the data for secondary analysis, and even if there's someone interested in the audience and doing a PhD thesis on all this material, there's plenty of material waiting to be analyzed. So for the media, just a quick review of what we analyzed. We have, for the Portuguese case, and this is interesting also in terms of epistemological considerations, which I will resume later on. We focused on 3 national newspapers. One, a reference daily newspaper, which is the first one, called Público. A popular newspaper, the one in the middle, Correio da Manhã, and the reference weekly newspaper, the one down the blue label, Expresso. So these were our references for the published newspapers. And we also analyzed the primetime news of 2 national broadcasters, television broadcasters, the public one, the first one, One Public, the blue label on the right, and the private one, TVI. So this was possible because in Portugal, both these TV broadcasters, these 2 have all the news available online in an open source database. And this allowed us to go back to 2017 and analyze all the news. This was not possible for a 3rd big broadcaster in Portugal called SIC, because they don't have the data publicly available, and it's very expensive to access that data. So this already gives us a hint of the kind of challenges we face when we have to make these choices that, of course, will then kind of position our look in the research topic. For the Brazilian case and the Australian case, actually, we had to follow a completely different methodology because we had not available the information, so we could not go back in time and analyze directly the newspapers or the television. There was no such source. So we retrieved the data through Factiva. Factiva is a news aggregator, so to speak, a private company that sells the news already aggregated. But this, as Sarah will also explain later on in the presentation in the afternoon, this has many pitfalls. In particular, for instance, for the case of Brazil, we had no TV broadcasts. So for each country, they have specific newspapers, but they don't have others. So if there was a specific newspaper that we would need, and if it's not available on Factiva, it was not possible for us to bring it to our sample. And this was the case also with the TV. So in Brazil, TV was not included. And in the Australian media, there is one national TV broadcaster, but only the transcriptions. And for all those here that come from media studies or that have analyzed media, images and products know that if you're analyzing TV, you need to look at the images. Like TV is all about the images and the emotions and the music and all the multisensorial also experience around the images. So this, of course, is already a specificity. So in terms of the media database, what did we analyze for each of these? The database, of course, is common to all these media, and our codebook, of course, has variables like this: name of the media, the country, location, type of news, time of news, name of the wildfire, because different wildfires strike in the same year, even. And our key variables, of course, are there animals or not in the piece of news. So this enabled us, what we did to make it clear, we selected a specific time frame that has a theoretical criteria. So since the outbreak of the fire until more or less 1 month or 1 month and a half after the fire, to cover the cycle of news, the news cycle after the event. And we collected all the news that had to do with fires. And for those, which are many, we only took note of very specific and very few variables, like these ones that we can see here. And then we had this key variable, which is the presence of animals. Are animals there or not? And when animals were there, then for those that were much fewer, then we would have other variables, namely the centrality, are they central or not, the alignment of the news, the main actors. So we dig deeper into those that mentioned animals. This particular thing enabled us to have a very specific result, which is kind of small when you talk about it, but for us is very important in terms of result, which is the prevalence. So, for instance, sometimes people feel that animals are very much showing up in the news, but when we look at the prevalence, as we'll see later on in the afternoon, actually it's very low. It's sometimes it's 8%, and of course it's difficult to measure because we don't have results from before, but we do have, at least in the case of Portugal, a very small timeline, which it doesn't vary very much, so it's always low, the prevalence. So the prevalence being the rate, the ratio between the news that mention animals and those that mention fire. So how many news within those that mention fires really talk about animals, and those are very fewer than those that mention fire. So this is just a print screen of our codebook. The codebook, I'm showing this because this is what enabled us to produce the consistency between the three, all the media and all the countries and all the years. So and also the consistency during the coding process, because we had, along these years, we had 7 different coders. And as we know, this is a challenge when we have many different people coding the same kind of material. The codes begin to vary, because what I code when I'm reading a piece of news and I'm coding these as animals as victims, for instance, but if David is reading that same piece of news, may code that as something else. And so we need to stabilize these categories, and the codebook is what allows us also to stabilize this codification process. So to give you examples of our categories, thematic categories, the themes, the topics that were being covered, we came up finally, eventually, so we have many more codes, and this is a grounding theory process. So we began with many specific codes, and then we go up in an abstraction process until what we call, and these are our macro categories, so are the big ones. And then eventually, in the quantitative analysis, we need to use the macro categories, because and even these macros, sometimes it's just 2 articles, 3 articles, and even those sometimes we need to exclude at some point because they're a bit of outliers of the rest. So emergency and rescue, victimized animals, death of animals, consequences of fire, post-fire help, adoption, affective, emotional, economic, relationship, and political attitudes. Some of them also, as you know, when we do content analysis, the categories are never fully stabilized, which means that sometimes we need to add new categories. This was the case with political attitudes, for instance, that came up when Sara was analyzing the material from Brazil, and it was a specific variable that hadn't been needed before we reached that stage. So our media database was first built, of course, in Excel, and then we exported it to SPSS, and all the data analysis took place in SPSS. But sometimes it's just easier to do things in Excel, and we go back to the Excel and we go back and forth. The final database will probably be available in Excel as soon as we stabilize it completely. Throughout the project, we'll also try to keep it stabilized, but as soon as this first phase ends, we'll stabilize it in terms of being used by other researchers, as I was explaining. When it comes to policy documents, we analyzed 3 countries as well, and different types of documents, and we'll go through this. Filippa will go through this after lunch, also in specific the results of this analysis. So it's legislation, parliamentary initiatives, parliamentary debates, national plans, and also other like reports, technical documents. Remember, it was not just about policy, it was also about official documents. Any kind of document that kind of sets the tone for a particular government to act upon animals in disasters. And the time frame is the same as with, more or less the same as with the media, so as to provide this methodological consistency we were talking about. There are specific things that need to be, that are worth discussing in the case of the different countries, because they have different organizations. For instance, Portugal has a national government that covers all the national House of Parliament that rules the country, but we don't have like federal different states within the same country, as is the case of Australia and Brazil, and this also offers food for thought from our point of view in terms of what would be worth also including other than what we already did. So in terms of the policy database, as you can see, it's more or less the same, but of course it has to be adapted to the kind of documents that we have at hand, just as like the legislative body that we of course don't have in the media database. So just to say that it's more or less the same database adapted to the specific data that we need to analyze, but the variables relating to animals are pretty much similar, and this also allows us to run similar analyses, which are interesting from our point of view of connecting the media agenda to the political agenda, as I was saying. So some keywords, examples, and the main themes. As you can see, they are quite similar. However, there are specificities that come from the fact that most of many of these documents are also from countries like, for instance, Australia. So the biodiversity conservation, biosecurity is a keyword that we couldn't find so much in the media database, but that was very much present in the policy database. So this also calls our attention to the need of be flexible. We need to be flexible when we're dealing with this kind of analysis. We need to be consistent. Being consistent means like insisting in seeing whether the categories we already have cover what we need to cover, but also we need to be open and flexible and try to see if those categories are enough or if it's worthwhile to add new ones. So this is how our policy database looks like at this point, and will look like possibly when we make it public for further analysis. So I'd like to focus on a few epistemological considerations, some food for thought for our discussion, which is, from my point of view, the most interesting part. So the goal of this presentation was mostly to describe the methodology, to stress the output of these 2 databases being available for further analysis of the academic community or interested community later on. And in terms of our discussion here today, and also thinking of what we need to do in the future in the project, the challenges that lie ahead of us as we stand here, I think there are things that we can pull out of this analysis and of this first part. So I would highlight the strengths, the quantification and measurement which is something that we are aware these are very quantitative, it's a very quantitative terminology, but what I mean here is that we could actually quantify and measure what we think are relevant indicators of how animals are represented. And this quantification, we know that sometimes it's useful also when talking with governance stakeholders, and also it's very useful when we are really trying to see reality as it is, rather than when we are simply getting like impressions of what. If we follow, for instance, the social media, it may seem that it's very prevalent, but I think that there are algorithms in the social media, as we know, and the social media we didn't analyze. I can get to that point later on. There's still some possibility of doing so, but we didn't at this point. But when we do that, and the algorithm feeding our feed with so many animals, it may seem that it's very prevalent. However, in this kind of mainstream media that are informative media, they're not very prevalent. So this is, I think, a strength of an analysis like this one, that this is one of the things we believe that it is still worth it. If we want to dig out what are the mainstream narratives, the ones that are really shaping the governance, I think it's still worthwhile looking at these indicators. So all these discursive practices are made objective. Then there's this thing that I also find it's a strength, which is the mixing qualitative and quantitative analysis, combining quantitative and qualitative analysis, or the other way around, because it allows us for the two parts. So, and we did that in several parts. I think we can go to that point later in the afternoon when we'll look at the data in different parts of the process. So we begin to go deep, and then we quantify, and then we go deep again. So there's this go back and forth between the qualitative and the quantitative that, from our point of view, really enriches the how we can get to this research topic. It provides rich and abundant information, and I think it allows an extensive characterization of these representations of animals in media and policy. And of course, it's always context specific, it's always specific to that sample, and we can talk about generalization issues also if you want in the discussion. And it's not so much about generalizing to all the media in the world, it's about understanding a logic of building a certain representation of the animals through public discourse. I think it's also very important to stress this common method to address different complementary sources, as I've said before, media and policy across different countries. So it's something that we are offering. So this is how we did it. We think it works. So if anyone wants to pick this up and develop from there, it would be something useful for the academic community. And as I said also before, it opens the way to explore the interplays between the media and the political agendas. And the public agenda, it should be stressed, could also be added. We didn't do that because that would be a whole different project. Already it seems a whole different project because it's so much. But we could add also the public agenda if we added the survey methodologies. Was it? Yes, another slide, yeah, because I knew I had 2 slides about the strengths. Something that's interesting also from our point of view, and that's actually something that's in our mind, is to use this information that we've come up with during this first phase with the governance stakeholders, namely in the last phase of the project. So the whole business, the whole thing about this first phase is to guide us also through the other phases. Not only guide us through the second phase, guide us through where we should focus our analysis, our observations, and so on, but also guide us on which stakeholders to sit with in the 4th phase of the project. How should we bring our cause to them? How can we contribute, for instance, to a reference manual of good practices in terms of dealing with the subject for journalists and for policymakers? So I think this is something we could build on. It proposes a method for data collection and classification, namely the codebook and the list of categories. All lists of categories are contextual and time contextual, so of course they will change with time, and they need to be flexible enough to evolve, but at least other researchers can pick on this and build on from there. A resource to the academic community, and to our knowledge, we haven't found other similar databases. Maybe there are. If there are, and someone who is listening to this talk right now or later on, because it will stay recorded, feel free to reach out to us, because we will be really thrilled to know about it. But to our knowledge, right now, we still don't know any like that. In terms of challenges, which are always much more interesting to think with, the challenges rather than the strengths, because they make us move on. It takes a lot of resources. So it took many more resources than we thought in the beginning, in terms of time, in terms of people involved, in terms of human resources. It was massive, I must say. It still is. That's the reason why we are only discussing today preliminary results from Portugal and Brazil, because the Australian data, they are still being processed. Henrique is still processing all the data, and then they will be analyzed, and we will be analyzing them as well. So it's massive. It was manual. We didn't use AI, and then I know there may be questions around why we didn't. It was mostly manual. So this is something to consider, whether this, to whoever wants to do something like this, the kind of resources, and actually to a certain point we realized a whole ERC could be done just about this first package, because it's really, there's a lot to do. The coding process and assuring the standardization of variables was also an interesting thing to do. Not only in terms of the thematic categories, the coding, but also assuring, as I was saying, the standardization across different coders and over time, because even the same person doesn't code the same piece, the very same piece in the very same way if we read it now or 3 years ago and in 3 years' time. So we will be different persons and we will code it in a different way. And this is very interestingly something that the referees, for instance, in journals, they ask, how did you assure the standardization of the coding process? So this is something to look to if you're methodologically considering doing something. And of course we all are, because the coding issues are not just about analyzing media, they're about analyzing interviews, about analyzing materials from ethnographic work. How do we assure this standardization? Of course, that when we're dealing with qualitative, we don't think so much about standardization, but it's something that putting this data in context that will always come up. These standardizations of sources and criteria also brought an interesting topic, which is how availability of data constrains the choices that we do, the media that we include, and how that will constrain, of course, the results we'll produce. Right? Because there were no televisions available in Factiva for Brazil, for instance, and we know that television in Brazil is really a huge thing. We will be cut off from that insights and that stream of information. And this happens all the time. So we have to work with the data that we have available, and so we need to consider this, and mostly we need to put our results in the context of these constraints and not be discouraged by that, of course. And also different availability of data across different countries. And this happened for the policies that Filippo will talk better later on, as for the media. So we don't have the same data available in different countries. In terms of policy, we didn't have federal legislation available. It was not so easy to get to specific local legislation, and there was no, to the best of our knowledge, at the point we did this, there was no product that we could resort to, nothing like we did to the media through Factiva, through this news aggregator. We couldn't reach this very specific legislation about disasters and animals in a federal basis. We also have time issues in terms of the criteria used in terms of time to cover the event. And these were criteria that had to do with the media agenda and how we conceive the media agenda. But of course, they can be discussed. But this means that when we cover, and this has to do with the media structure and the media coverage, because the news values are much about the exception and the emotion and the upheaval. This means that the recovery phase is much less present in our result, and what's more present is the emergency phase and the emergency phase. So yes, the media type important as well, because it seems that today the social media are pretty much where everything is happening in terms of conveying images, namely Instagram, so social media that's more based on visual materials. However, and this has to do with time, with constraints, and the time constraints and human resources constraints, we still didn't include the social media. And so there was an option, it was really an option, to focus on informational media, namely newspapers, because there are studies also that say that information media, so mainstream media, are the ones where people gather information from. So when we are looking for information, we go to traditional media. If it's about emotion and knowing how to react emotionally, then it's more social media. So this was, it has an argument behind it, but it was actually a choice, and choices kind of determine always our results, and I think this is something that we must bring to the discussion as well. And what does this not allow? Of course, it does not allow for empirical generalizations to other years, for instance, to other countries, to other media, all those implications of generalization, but it does allow to test, for instance, for differences within the same country, within the same sample. We have enough data for that. So this would be our highlights. On behalf of the team that worked mainly in this first package, which is Filipa, Sara, and myself. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward for your contributions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Verónica, and the co-authors of this very nice and very interesting material. So this means that you have showing us these two abide between media and policy databases, these two databases, I would say, and built, which means very time consuming, as you pointed out, cross-national and slated for open release. So I think that looking on the elements you show us, I would point in here maybe two or three ideas, and then I will also for sure open the discussion for the audience. So starting with the rigor, you mentioned manual coding only. And as you know, listening about this, I was thinking about why not to use artificial intelligence into this analysis. Furthermore, I think that okay, you can use at this point. You have a lot of work already done with this hands-on approach, which means that you are in a perfect position to test the artificial intelligence with this material, not with new material, but with this material, in order to use it to validate the artificial intelligence approach. Okay, so the idea is not to start with the AI, with new material, but with those material we have already analyzed, and using the elements you use also in code in order to test and to train the artificial intelligence tool in order to give you a result that you can compare and can validate with the one you have already get. Okay, so it is something that, in my opinion, you should think about. Okay. Then I am let's say put two other topics over the table. The first is the availability. Let's say to put this material available to other people, to other research, and also to in association with this, maybe another thing that is related with the longevity of this data. In my opinion, I was listening you, and I think that you are thinking to make all of this data and also the database is open when the ABIDE is finished. I think you should do it before. Okay. For sure. I think that you should start publishing the methodology as soon as possible, using as soon as possible, which means when you feel it enough consolidated, you should publish. Not publish the data, but publish the methods. Okay, and I was listening to you, and I write here, for instance, because there are some scientific journals exactly focus on this kind of topic. For instance, it is not the only one, but there is one journal published by Elsevier named Methods X, which is perfect for this kind of contribution. Which means, in fact, you are putting there, okay, we are building two databases in order to capture and to aggregate information on this subject. Okay, because doing this. For sure, all around the world there are a lot of, maybe not a lot, but for sure some researchers also interested in these topics, and they can also try to use your approach and to refine it and to interact with your team. Okay. The longevity is another topic, and the point is who will fund the correction of this data after 2028. And I think, okay, it is still a lot of years before, but we, you and all of us, which are interested in the ABIDE project, and of course also the ABIDE results, should think about this. The idea is not to finish, okay, when the project is finished, the work should go on in some way. Okay, my last point, or my last idea is looking on the impact measurement about the work you are developing now. And the idea is what indicator will tell you that publish this data actually will change wildfire governance practice. Right? If it is possible to think. Okay, so yeah, I have also some minor questions. The point is, how many people within the team is allowed to put information into the database? I am talking about it because some years ago I was the PI of a project when we built a disaster database for Portugal. In fact, I was not allowed. I was the PI. I was not allowed to put data inside. Okay, so and yeah. For sure, they put me out. Okay, you cannot. So I could, of course, assess the database. But in fact, in order to maintain the consistency of the database, because in my opinion, this is the most critical point of any database, is to maintain consistency inside the data, which means that that is the reason why for this disaster project, only 3 of my team were able to put data inside the database. Okay, and I will in as I said before, I was not one of these 3, so I could screening, I could enter the database, but not to digitize information inside. And yeah, so you have enough questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I must say that that project of yours called Disaster, right?
Yeah,
the database. It's really inspiring, even though we've had this conversation many times already. Coming from media studies originally, yeah. I also have many critical points also on your approach because, anyway, but it's very inspiring the way it's still open to the academic community as a resource, and that's actually an ambition also of this project. So congratulations for that, and thank you for your questions. I kind of knew that you would come up with the artificial intelligence one, so I left it to the discussion. Actually, we really wanted an artificial intelligence solution when we resorted to the Factiva, and I was really helpful. It needs to be said that when we first began to think about this approach, all this vibe and this hype around artificial intelligence was still not on. So when we began to think about the methodology and to define the methodology, there was not this hype still. So this broke a few years, not that much time ago. But of course now it's here, and now it has many benefits, and I was really hopeful that it will help us when we resorted to Factiva. And then we bumped into this reality, which is it produced these long PDF documents that could not even be downloaded in a very simple, not AI solution, which is an Excel file. And I was really surprised with this. I thought, wow, well, how come that with all this conversation around AI and all this, when we asked for specific pieces of news in Factiva in Brazil and in Australia, we can't download an Excel database in a line we have each piece of news. It's not possible. So what was possible is like this big PDF in which in each PDF there are many news, and Sara and now Henrique have been building the database, taking one by one. So each piece of news. So why am I telling this? To highlight and praise the work of people like Sara and Henrique, of course, without which it wouldn't be possible to have all this data. But also to stress that I think there's a hype which I understand, but from the practical point of view, when you're working with data, at least we still didn't find the right solution for us. It's not that it's not there for us to find, and maybe it will find us before we find it, the solution, but we really needed a solution, for instance, to this. I was hoping that AI would help us to retrieve those pieces of data. And so this is the first part of my discussion, which is I understand the possibilities, more or less. I need to be honest, I don't understand fully the possibilities. That's why we organized a small event on artificial intelligence and the study with animals a few months ago. But I do understand the possibilities of working with massive amounts of data, of documents, for instance, and reduce, which is actually the question with huge quantities of information. That's also what we're doing with this method of the database. We're reducing the data because it's massive. We have like 4,000 of pieces of news, and then we'll present like this, and it's a reduction of the data, but a reduction that is supposed to be heuristic. So here I have two different layers of thought to add to this discussion. The first is that we haven't come across the right solution for us, and we wish we had, because it would have been very helpful. And something that would have been very helpful was a very simple. It's not that we want AI to do the analysis for us. We would have loved to have some help in putting this database together, and still it was not possible. The other thing is that the analysis, we really didn't delegate the analysis in the tool. So the analysis was made by us. And for that, I don't think there's, of course, possibly you can train the machine.
Yeah.
You can train the machine to do that, but yeah, the project is not about AI, so we didn't have the resources to train it. So I think we have these two different layers, the technical one for the purposes we needed, and then the most substantial and the content one, which is we didn't delegate that part, the part of reading a piece of news and saying what's inside there. So maybe I'll jump here to your last question, which is how many persons are allowed to, not many. So Filipa did that at some point, then we passed it on to Sara, and now Sara is working with Henrique. So now only Sara and Henrique feed the database. I don't feed the database either, because it requires a trained eye, it requires a consistency, and only those that are working full-time in doing that can do that consistently, because we learn by doing. So, and we don't want, there's a lot of human error, as we know. So that's for sure a measure of quality in terms of building the data and feeding the data. I would say in terms, I think I'll jump to the longevity here, because it's relevant. It's also about the workload, the longevity. In terms of the policies, we are able to assure the feeding of the database until the end of the project. That is not the case with the media, because the media are so massive in terms of the production of the pieces of news that we need not even one single person, unless then we find an AI solution that does that for us, but then we need to correct the solution as well. We need to have someone constantly checking if the AI is classifying as we want it to classify. And now, as this first phase of the project ends, we are all moving and transitioning already to the second phase, and then the third, and then the fourth phase of the project. So in terms of the media, we will stabilize here. And the feeding of the data, the longevity, and so making sure that it keeps being fed over the years, it's something that I think it's very valuable. It's not within this, we can't make it, unfortunately. We don't have the resources for that. Either we find another additional source of funding, or someone does that as a PhD project, for instance. I think that would be a solution. Thank you for the suggestion of the article of the method, just about the methods. I admit that we hadn't think of that, just an article just about the methods. We have a couple of them coming out soon about the results, in which of course we talk about the methodology, but not a specific one. But maybe it's useful, because this kind of, I call them a little bit of support articles. Yeah. Sometimes, I don't know if you agree, but sometimes I find that substantial articles, they lack a little bit of information about the methodology. They're not so, they don't go as deep into the methodology as I like them to go, because I think we really learn. First, we need to situate our results in terms of the methods. There are no results outside of the methods used, and sometimes I feel that they lack information on that. And so if we have a dedicated article just about the methods, which we can just refer to that. So I think it's a very useful approach. There's a very important one about impact measurement. Will publishing these data change fire governance? That's $1 million question. Will everything, anything of what we do change fire governance? Hopefully, yes. Step by step, small steps. So I would say if we include in fire governance also the media stakeholders, so a broad definition of governance, in the sense that all those producing discourses in the public sphere have a word to say in terms of governance. I think our results could be useful, for instance, in terms of suggesting good practices when reporting on animals during a disaster, maybe articulate partner up with the journalists and associations of journalists in terms of providing a short crash course on how animals could be represented in these events in different ways. Trying to help work with journalists and media practitioners and other animal scholars in terms of walking towards a more than human journalism, how we call it. So on that side, I think there's an impact that is possible. I don't think it's immediate. I don't think that it's possible within the time frame of these projects, even though these projects seem long. 5 years seems long in terms of project, but it's not long to change this kind of attitudes and stakeholders and namely governance. To the policy, changing the policy makers and how policy makers are defining the policies, that's a completely different challenge. I think it's, but of course, this is where the media and the political agenda really intertwine. And so I think that when we wish to get to policy makers, we need to address also the media producers and the media discourses, because policy makers also follow the media and vice versa. So this is where I think it's useful to use this information when we are discussing our results with policy governance stakeholders more to the end of the project, in which we have the ambition to have these workshops with the governance stakeholders. It's not so much a change in terms of behavior like immediate change, it's more like weaving together a new way of looking at these questions, of looking at animals. So I think, I don't know if I've addressed all your questions. Thank you so much for the suggestions and questions. I think there was a question in the audience, but I was still.
Yes. In any case, I have just one more question, which is a quite practical one. How many entries have you already into these two databases?
It depends on the countries. I think, sorry about my heart. Do you know how many entries in the Portuguese data? I think it's 400 something. We don't know by heart.
400, yeah?
Yes,
for the Portuguese case.
Just for the Portuguese case, and then we have the Brazilian case with the many. Doesn't work.
Yes. Now, for sure, in any case, you have enough cases to publish the method, I think, yeah, and to discuss it. Because, for instance, for this paper, Verónica, you can discuss all the coding problem and all the coding approach you have to define. Okay. And you can, and for sure, this paper will be very useful for other scholars.
The future coders.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just wanted to add that the Portuguese database has from 2017, 2022, 23, 24, around 6,500 news. And the Brazilian database has around 1,600 news, or 700.
Time for publishing. So, yeah. Okay, now we have 2 or 3 questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you for presenting this database. It seems to me to be a Herculean task to produce something like that. I was very impressed. My question is about the preliminary results of producing these. And I'm very curious about the differences between countries, because as you said, the countries are not commensurate. They have some similarities, of course, Portugal and Brazil with the same language, Brazil and Australia with being almost continental countries. And so I was wondering, as you started, I'm sure as you started processing all of this information, there must have been differences in the approach to fires that came through, even in the way they're categorized in the media, the way animals are presented there. Portugal being a very small country, there's not so much variety in terms of the animals. In Brazil and in Australia, I mean, the animals in one region of Brazil differ wildly from the animals in another region. So how that is navigated, and whether just by going through all of this information, you started seeing some patterns emerging in a preliminary analysis. So I'm very curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for your question. There are some differences that arise. For instance, I do remember one that we're going to discuss this later today. For instance, in Brazil, topics about the victimization of animals are more related to wildlife and wild animals, whilst in Portugal they're more related to farmed animals or to livestock, as well as companion animals. And so this brings a difference. In Brazil, wildlife and these particular fires that we have in the database are those in Pantanal in 2020 and the Amazon in 2019. So it's where those biomes and wildlife were severely affected, and wildlife in particular flagship species, so species that are kind of held as a flag for and very symbolic, very protected. In Brazil, onça pintada, that appears very much, being very, also looked at as subject, so he has a name. There was ousado, que a Filipa vai falar logo. And in Portugal, on the contrary, it's very much about how livestock producers in the north lost their herds, and so the economic activities are at risk. So for instance, there may not be a specific kind of cheese that is produced in the region because all the pasture was affected, and so the sheep have no food, and so they don't produce milk, and sometimes even the herds were affected, and even the herds were burnt, and so the animals were killed. So I think there are a few differences. However, there are tropes that are very consistent. For instance, these three big tropes, there's a lot of reporting in the phase of emergency. Then the kind of animals that gets reported may vary a little bit, and we still don't have the data from Australia in the analysis. We'll see. But our hypothesis is that wildlife issues are also very present there. At least that's what we found in the policy documents. There's the trope about animals as victims. And then, so I think even though, of course, we could discuss whether our framework in terms of themes of the categories are already conducting the way we are producing these results, because we had already these categories. But the thing is that methodology is bottom up. So when we analyze the data, if it doesn't fit the categories we already have, we just create a different category, which reassures us more or less that there's a cognitive consistency, if I may there, across the very different realities when it comes to reporting on how animals are affected. And of course then we have the local context that will bring this, as I was saying, for instance, Pantanal and the Amazon and wildlife, the wildlife topic being very present, and the exotic animals that we don't have here in Portugal. And I would say also that in Portugal we have the topic of companion animals that have begun to be included since the fires in 2017. There was this big discussion in the governance and the policy makers among them about including them in the rescue plans. For the very traditional, it's a very well-known fact that farmers and people with domestic animals and pets don't want to leave when the fires strike. So this is obviously a very important motivation. It was a very important motivation to bring that topic. And so from when we look at the data in 2022, we already see that showing up a little bit in terms of as well as other farmed animals like the sapper goats, helping to prepare to care for the fields in the mitigation phase, because they eat the grass, and so they're helpful in preventing the fires. Whilst, for instance, in Brazil, the discussion is more about o boi bombeiro, so the ox, that it was very politicized also in Brazil, whether the livestock would be helpful in mitigating the fires, and then this political discussion then actually it doesn't, because then it's much more vulnerable to fire the territory after the desmatamento, so after deforestation, to make room for the cattle. So I think there are common tropes that then get specific highlights in each context.
Okay. Isabel?
Congratulations for the hard work. Database is always a hard work. And I want to know if you have manual of codification for all the team, for Portugal, Brazil, and Australia. And if the manual have also the categorization of the work. Because I think if to have some methods, you need the manual to uniformize the data and the process. It's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, we do. We don't call it a manual, we called it the code book. So it's a code book. It's where we have and we've done it from the very, very first start, all the decisions, the methodologic decisions and this is very important in terms of methodology for those that are maybe also in the online audience listening to us and are doing their PhD thesis or master thesis. Whatever decision we make, we need to make note of it, and we need to put it in the manual, because we will forget it later on because it's very long, the work is very long, it entails many different steps. So what we did from the very first start, we took note of every decision we were making and how we were deciding. So when this type of data we're going to categorize as victims. Why? And then we have a specification in the code book in which we describe what's inside that category. So as I was saying, we have like the first topic. The topics were very grounded, so it means they were very detailed. And from there, we went up in an abstraction, a progressive abstraction process until what we called the macro categories. And for each one of these, we have the definition. And then we had, this is also very important in terms of methods and methodology, we had regular meetings to discuss this, to discuss whether those that were codifying, sometimes it was just one person, sometimes it was several persons at the same time. And so we had regular meetings to discuss how the codification was being done and if we were all in the same page. And of course that every now and then we had to check whether we were creating new categories for something that was already there. As we know, sometimes it happens. So sometimes we just create a new category, but it's just like another one we already have in the database. So we did this kind of cleaning of the database regularly, recategorizing something that could be doubled. So we do have a manual of codification that not only has all of our decisions, but also what does it mean, what's inside of each one of those decisions. So each one of the coders can resort to that manual, to that code book. Whenever they have doubts, they go to the code book and check how is this being coded. And if it doesn't work, then we meet and then we discuss.
Must be one of the results.
Okay.
It's something very important because we don't have resources to maintain the database, but the codification, the code book is something that is sustainable, is definitive. You know.
True. Very good point. Thank you so much for pointing to that. The code book is stabilized, and of course it can be discussed. maybe it's not completely definitive in the sense that new topics will come up, of course, but they can be added. But those that are there can be used in different, and I think that would be one of the powers of this. Exactly, that's something that could be useful for future researchers that wanted to. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation, and I chip in on what others have said, that this is a really ambitious venture. So it's fantastic to hear about these numbers. Just putting these numbers in an abstract when you submit an article, they are so impressive. So the article will be accepted immediately just because of the large data set. But of course, I mean, I also read the paper about the 2017 wildfire, which is absolutely excellent and very convincing. Also, not just because of the data, but because of the argumentation, of course. But I was thinking the discussion around social media. I think maybe in a case like this, with such an extreme event, it makes sense not to turn to social media immediately, because I mean the people getting close to these areas are mainly like professional journalists who are used to working in disaster areas, and of course like firemen and other professionals. So this is the material that feeds into social media. When it comes to people's relationship with their pets, for example, if I would study pet keeping, I would probably turn to social media and see how people make their own videos and share them. But in this case, it's probably quite rare that private persons are able to document what happens very well, because they are on the run and won't be able to record the videos. So I think you have a good argument for not turning to social media, at least not immediately. And then if you would turn to social media, and maybe this is more of a question, then the question would be, so the social media or what, so to speak? I mean, would you look at how animal activists report taking care of animals, or would you look at how local communities help each other to rebuild farms, or would you look and how they write about that in social media, or would you look at how the public reactions of horror of the images? And I mean, it's so social media, I think, it's so divided now, so you would have to look at like hashtags or certain bubbles or forums, or be more specific in that case. So maybe that's another argument for staying with your huge material of news articles a bit more. So I hope you're able to get more funding soon to continue working with this material.
Thank you. Me too. Not sure it would be just for the media, but we have so much to do also in the other part. But thank you, David, for bringing the social media question. It's really important, and it gives me the opportunity also to talk a little bit about that part, because there's a reflection in the team already done about the social media and how we want to handle, and then we just had to slow it down and focus. We do have a strong argument around sticking to traditional media in terms of getting information that's relevant for the stakeholders, because those are the media really that are more linked in terms of getting information, relevant information from the public. And the public uses traditional media to get information, whilst social media is more about promoting an immediate response. And it's more, I would say that nowadays, even traditional media also use a lot social media, so that would be an approach to also integrate in the study of traditional media the way they convey also through social media specific things. But that was not what we are thinking. So the traditional media, this is what we're doing for the traditional media. For the social media, our approach would be more on an event. So focus on specific, so two different approaches, I would say. One is following specific accounts, for instance, of animal organizations working in disaster emergency, or animal activists, specific accounts that could be followed constantly during a specific period in what we call an online ethnography. That, of course, entails specific resources, including a researcher fully dedicated to the online ethnography. It's not something that we can do while we do something else. As all ethnographies, it requires specific resources. The other approach is to address specific events. So when a fire outbreaks, and that would mean not fires that took place already a while ago, like the ones we studied in this database, but the ones that will break out soon, because they always do. So that's the second approach. And then we follow the hashtag and we follow the fire, which is interesting for us because the fire is a very, as I said before, a very important modern human agent in the project. So we would also follow the fire in the social media, which is interesting for us. And the third approach is to focus on a specific topic, theme. And I'm thinking of a very particular theme that's very important in the project, which you are also very interested in, which is death, grief, and mourning, and how grief and mourning is performed through social media in relation to fires and animals, in particular wildlife. In Brazil, it was the case of wildlife, ousado, and other species. In Australia, the kangaroos, the koalas. And in Portugal is mostly the companion animals, or not so much livestock in the social media. In the social media, it's mostly companion animals, I would say. But so that would be a third approach, which would be more substantive. So the criteria here would be the topic. That we would also follow that same topic in other sources in the project. So we will also follow the topic of death, grief, and mourning in our interviews, in our ethnography, in our engagement with the local populations and animals. And then we would follow that topic also in social media, like addressing the same topic in different layers of reality, because there are different realities. It's not the same reality mirrored. It's a different reality built with specific affordances. And of course, this means choosing which social media, as we know. And I think a word must be said about this. When I first drafted the project in the beginning, I was thinking of 3 main social media: Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Then after the project, when the project was already, I'm not sure if we had already begun the project, but at some point Twitter turned to X. All the political complications around X and Elon Musk, and we decided to drop Twitter altogether, or X, so we're not contributing to that discussion in the project, which means that the most prevalent one would be Facebook and Instagram. Facebook, as we know, having an older audience right now, so the youngers not being so much present on Facebook, which led us mostly to Instagram, which has a more visual culture, and visuals being important in the emergency phase, very important, and in conveying a message about animals. Instagram would probably be our choice. We didn't think of TikTok or nothing like that. We kind of thought of Instagram because it is an interesting mix between still having the younger users and the prosumers, so those that produce and consume both. That very, as we know, a very important feature in social media, but also of institutional accounts. So the institutional accounts are also leveraging on Instagram a lot. And Instagram, from my point of view, also has an interesting thing, brings an interesting topic to the discussion, which is the problematic topic of images that we also will discuss tomorrow. So how vision also becomes mainstream if we focus all our understanding of animals and situation of animals in one single sensorial sense, how we see things, and the Instagram lives a lot from images. There's a whole critical discussion we also can do about that. And just want to say that there is an important discussion going on also on the impact of the social media in mobilizing the populations in the emergency phase. Our project is not about emergency phase, and this is something we often come back to. So if we want, because we want to focus in the recovery phase, and the recovery phase is much less present in this kind of way of making the animals visible in the public sphere. It's mostly about the emergency phase. And there are other things that are being discussed about this, which is the mobilization of people in the emergency phase, but then the unpreparedness of these volunteers that come up to the disaster zone, but they're not really prepared. So we need to prepare them in advance. We need to train people to know how to act in an emergency situation so as to help animals. So there's an important discussion there as well. And also how they, and this has been studied by people before, how they just they go away, and all the animal NGOs, for instance, are left with all the animals to take care. But then the volunteers are not there anymore because the hype of the emergency phase was. So there are interesting things to discuss around the powers of social media that would require different methodological approaches. But now we thought of 3 different approaches that we could also pursue.
Just a small question. The last one.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I am sociologist and research about the social and economy and policy. I think it's necessary protection by state and by government for animal, because it's necessary for finance and formation for population in the state, in the town, in the city, for protection for animals. Because, do you know, situation between countries like Spain and Portugal and Greece is very different like Australia. Because education and adaptation is very different. And adoption is very different. I think it's necessary formation for population by television and by the movies and by the newspaper, because it's very, 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 very good for welfare and for care for animals. It's very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comment. And thank you for bringing the topic of funding, which is really important when... So the question of funding, that we'll see in the afternoon, will come up in the ways these news are being constructed. In particular, how farmers are being compensated for their economic losses and animals being simulated to economic losses. And so this financial dimension is definitely a dimension that we need to account for. Thank you.
Okay,
so yeah, it's just a quick question because I'm not staying in the afternoon. So probably in the afternoon you'll talk about it. But as a reply to Patricia, you was saying about the news on wild animals in Pantanal in Brazil. And I wonder if you are aiming at doing some analysis that will, instead of like making a contrast between, let's say, Portugal and Brazil, making a contrast on news having to do with specific natural reserves, like Pantanal would be to Serra da Estrela in Portugal. So how are you willing now to make the analysis so that you also overcome those problems of comparison?
Thank you, Susanna. Very relevant question, the question of comparison. We are very cautious with strict comparisons, and we've discussed historically in the project. It's it's a temptation because it's 3 countries, same topic, same time, same year, but the context is so specific and brings so many. So we, to be honest, I think we go back and forth between being very picky and very, how can I phrase it? Very conscious about the limit, how we need to be cautious with comparing because of the differences in context and situations. And of course, the emergence of the data that brings the same trope, for instance, that brings the question of the victimization of animals is very important in the reporting, which goes back from our point of view to a very generalized way of narrating animals in our culture, Western culture. So we go back and forth between those approaches. We are very cautious with comparing because the contexts are very different. But the fact is that we have data from the policies also that we can put in dialogue. So how we are doing this, we are putting our results in dialogue. It's like a dialogue, polyvocal thing. Avoiding very strict comparisons because, as we know, to make a comparison, all the a priori elements must be more or less equal, which is never the case when we are dealing with very different realities. Even the scale, like in Brazil, is so different. The case of the Amazon, with all the, not only the Amazon, the important role of the indigenous communities, it's so different. So how we are dealing with this is creating a dialogue between what we find when we analyze, for instance, the policy documents, what we find when we analyze the media documents in Portugal, and what we find, and so on and so forth, avoiding strict comparison.
Yeah, but what I was suggesting was actually that you could put in dialogue. Well, comparison is a full theme to discuss, but the wild perspective on animals. When fires come to territories that are environmental territories that are conserved by the state, which is the case in Pantanal, and it is the case in Serra da Estrela, and precisely it would be interesting to see different ways of looking at what is happening to that territory, right?
Thank you. Now I got your question. Thank you. I think I hadn't gotten it in the first part. Definitely. And what's interesting is that in Brazil and also Australia, they have very important species, like in Brazil, the onça pintada, in Australia, the koala, that became, and also the kangaroo to a certain extent, that became kind of the brand of the topic. We don't have the same in Portugal as much, at least as much. We have specific endemic species that were very much affected, como a lagartixa da montanha, I can't remember the lagartixa, and a specific kind of escaravelho, can't remember the name of the genus, but they're not as mediatic, they're not media prone. So they're not being used still by conservationists in the same way in the media. But definitely it's interesting to look at those conservationist discourses in the media in across the 3 different countries.
Okay. So thank you very much, Verónica. Thank you very much for the audience. We are not with a large number, but all of them are quite interesting to participate and to collaborate with the EBIDE. So thank you very much, and time to lunch.
Thank you.